We're very happy to have with us Heather Cass-White, who is the editor of this book here. Heather spent the last 10 years working on this book. Is that true? Something like that?
2 other editions in there too, but...
Yes, in 2008 and in 2012, you published other editions of Marianne Moore's poetry. Heather's currently professor of English at the University of Alabama, and she received her master's and PhD degrees from Cornell University. So would you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Heather Cass-White?
Thank you everybody for being here. I did work for about 10 years on Marianne Moore, and the latest product of that work is this book. So this just came out in June. And it is intended to, in some sense, replace this book. All right, so Marianne Moore was part of a group of American modernist poets. Modernism means she wrote her most important stuff between the world wars, so between 1918 and 1945. She knew everybody who was worth knowing at that time. She edited a prominent magazine. She was deeply involved in the life of American poetry. But why she's really important is that she was a poet herself. And in 1967, she edited her own complete poems. She was in her 80s when she did this. So she left this book as her final word on what she wanted the world to know of her work. That's why it's called Complete. So there's Marianne Moore. You can see that she lived a long time, and she wrote most of that time. She's an enormously productive poet. The 2 Marianne Moores that you sort of need to know about are the Moore in 1935. In this picture, she's about 48. In the 30s, she's doing what I think is her best work. She's sort of as good as she'll ever be. There she is in the 1950s, when she's 66 in that picture, I think. By the 1950s, she had started to dress in that costume that you see here, the tricorn hat and the cape. She intended it to remind you of George Washington. She put it on, she wore it for the rest of her life. All the photographs you'll ever see of Moore, quite likely, unless you study her deeply, will be from that period when she became kind of a public figure. The Moore that I'm interested in is this one, when she's about 20 years younger. She does not dress in costume. She's still just a normal person, and she's writing great poetry. The reason it matters which Moore I'm interested in is because that Moore, the one starting in the 1950s, began revising her own work. So up until 1935, through 1935, she publishes at least half of her life's work. In the 1950s, when she begins to collect it, she goes back and she changes it radically. This matters, again, because the book that she left as her record was published in 1967. So this book, the book that everybody has studied of Marianne Moore, anybody who studies Moore has used this book, everybody is reading the late Moore. And that doesn't just mean the Moore who wrote poems later in her life, it means the Moore who went back and changed the poems she wrote early in her life. So I thought, and a lot of people thought, that her complete poems was mistitled. It's not actually complete. It leaves out a lot of poems. A lot of the poems it includes are radically changed. And I wanted to go back and give people what I thought was the true complete poems, which means every poem that she wrote and the poems in their original versions as she originally published them. So I'm going to read a famous poem of Moore's called Poetry. This is arguably her most famous poem. She first published this in 1924. I put it up here. I hope you can follow along a little bit. I should say that my PowerPoint skills have been described as pathetic and cringeworthy. So I apologize to the School of Visual Arts for imposing them on you. All right, so here's poetry. I too dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers that there is in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must, these things are important, not because a high-sounding interpretation can be put upon them, but because they are useful. When they become so derivative as to become unintelligible, the same thing may be said for all of us, that we do not admire what we cannot understand. The bat holding on upside down or in quest of something to eat, elephants pushing, a wild horse taking a roll, a tireless wolf under a tree, the immovable critic twitching his skin like a horse that feels a flea, the baseball fan, the statistician. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. One must make a distinction, however. When dragged into prominence by half-poets, the result is not poetry, nor till the poets among us can be literalists of the imagination, above insolence and triviality, and can present for inspection imaginary gardens with real toads in them, shall we have it. In the meantime, if you demand on one hand the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is, on the other hand, genuine, then you are interested in poetry. Okay, so any poet who writes a poem called poetry is going to be dogged by that poem for the rest of their lives, and Moore certainly was. I mean, this is taken to be her statement, her ars poetica, her statement of the poetic art, and it was. Here's some reasons that people like this poem, reasons that people quote it. First of all, there's that first line, I too dislike it. That tells you something about how cheeky Moore was and surprising. The last thing one expects a poet to say about poetry is that they dislike it, but she said it and she meant it. The phrase, we do not admire what we cannot understand. She was really good at coming up with epigrams, quotable little bits of language that sort of said pithy things that people like. So we do not admire what we cannot understand, which is something I say to my own students all the time when they complain they don't understand the poetry. I say, that's natural. No one likes what they don't understand. Nor is it valid to discriminate against business documents and school books. All these phenomena are important. This is less catchy than it is a kind of example of why people thought she was doing something new and interesting as a poet. She wanted all kinds of language in poems. She didn't want to take it from, didn't have to come from classical sources or fancy sources or even literary sources. She wanted the language of advertisement, of newspapers, of magazines, things she saw on the subway. Anything that she saw was fair game for poetry. And finally, this phrase, imaginary gardens with real toads in them. This is probably the most famous phrase she ever wrote, and people love it as a description of what poetry is. I don't really know what it means, but I love it too. Imaginary gardens with real toads in them. So there's her catchy phrases. Here's an example of why formally people find her interesting, why she was writing a different kind of poetry than most people usually write. So the first thing, I have syllabic stanzas, subtle rhymes, snaky sentences. So syllabic stanzas. The way Moore arranged her stanzas, her grouping of lines within a poem, was by syllable count. So the first line of this stanza has 14 syllables, then 22, 11, 5, 8, 13. And if you when you see this poem laid out on the page, every stanza will obey that principle. Each line in the same position will have the same number of syllables. This is a crazy way to organize a unit of poetry. Really, I mean, it's nutso. It has nothing to do with the English language. There's really no precedent for it in English. This was her invention, and she stuck to it throughout her life. She once said that after 1921, she said, after 1921 or so, I never wrote a poem that did not, in my opinion, rhyme, which I think is terrific. Think about that. Her rhyme was a matter of opinion. You can see why here. The poem has a rhyme scheme, but it's very hard to hear. It's almost impossible to hear it when you read aloud. You have to see it. So we have in and genuine, eyes and rise. And again, this pattern will repeat throughout the whole poem. So the middle 4 lines of each stanza will rise like that. And they will tend to rhyme on words like in, unusual rhyme words. Finally, there are the snaky sentences. So Moore's sentences tend to behave independent of her poetic stanzas. Her lines do not end where the sentence ends. The sentence is an independent unit. So I tried to highlight this so you could see it. The first 2 sentences are actually unusual because the line ends where the sentence ends, this fiddle. The next sentence takes up 2 lines. Much more typical is this final one. Hands that can grasp, eyes that can dilate, hair that can rise if it must. These things are important not because A. and that's where the line ends. The sentence, of course, continues on. So in any given Moore poem, you've got two structures. You have the stanzas as they're laid out on the page, and then you have the sentences as they make their way through the stanza form. So for each poem, she invented a new stanza form. Every time, they're all different, but by and large, they all follow a syllabic pattern. Okay, so those are things that people really liked about Moore, and in particular, they really liked about poetry. Lots of catchy phrases, lots of interesting images, all of this tricky formal stuff. Here is the poem as she included it in her 1967 complete poems, all right? So we looked at 1924, here's 1967. So in 1967, if you bought this book, the complete poem called Poetry says, I too dislike it, reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. Finito. Done. That's it. So you can see why people who like Moore have a problem with her editing of the complete poems. Here's another poem, published in 1924, called Roses Only. Again, I didn't mark it, but maybe you can just see a very tight syllabic structured stanza form. So each stanza has the same number of lines, and each line has the same number of syllables. And it's an erratic pattern, but it is replicated 3 times. So Roses Only. You do not seem to realize that beauty is a liability rather than an asset. That in view of the fact that spirit creates form, we are justified in supposing that you must have brains. For you, a symbol of the unit, stiff and sharp, conscious of surpassing by dint of native superiority and liking for everything self-dependent, anything an ambitious civilization might produce, for you, unaided to attempt through sheer reserve to confute presumptions resulting from observation, is idle. You cannot make us think you a delightful happen-so. But Rose, if you are brilliant, it is not because your petals are the without which nothing of preeminence. You would, minus thorns, look like a what is this? A mere peculiarity. They are not proof against a worm, the elements, or mildew, but what about the predatory hand? What is brilliance without coordination? Guarding the infinitesimal pieces of your mind, compelling audience to the remark that it is better to be forgotten than to be remembered too violently, your thorns are the best part of you. This is a really, I think this is Moore at her best. So she takes on a traditional subject, the rose. Lots of poetry has been written about roses. And she comes at it at an utterly fresh angle. So for her, the petals are nothing. The petals are incidental. What really makes the rose important and interesting are the thorns. The thorns are what guide it or guard it. The thorns are what give it integrity. So there's Roses Only. There's 1924. Here is the version she published in 1967. She took it out. Roses Only disappears. The only way you would actually know about that poem is if you knew about Moore's work at the time that she wrote it. You would have to be a reader of hers in the 1930s, because by 1967, well, actually by 1951, it had completely disappeared. That's something of a pattern with Moore. It's not just that she dropped poems, it's that she dropped really good ones. I think you could argue that she dropped some of her best ones. So that's why I came along and edited this book, and I restored lots of poems that I like Roses Only, and I restored lots of poems to their earlier forms, like poetry, which now is back in its multi-stanza version. So part of what I wanted to do today was make you like Marianne Moore, but the other sneaky thing I wanted to do was to convince you that being an editor is actually really interesting work. Nobody really knows what editors do or what we are, but we're actually really important. So what I'd like to do is involve you in a little editing exercise. I'm going to give you a sense of the kind of decisions I made. So there were big decisions, like which poems to put in the book and which versions of which poems to put in the book. But there are a million little tiny decisions to make too, the kind of decisions that nobody will ever even know that I had to make. So I'm going to give you an example of one of these, and you can tell me what you think. So one of Moore's most famous poems is called The Plummet Basilisk, and it's about this lizard, which runs on water. I've read The Plummet Basilisk, I don't even know how many times in my life. Years and years worth of times. But when I was working on this book, I was reading it, and I got to this line. now where sapotans drop their nuts out on the stream, and I realized that I didn't know what a sapotan was, and I felt really embarrassed that all these years I'd been reading it, I had no idea what a sapotan was. So I Googled, and that's what I got back. No sapotan. You will notice that one of the options that it did not give me was the word that I had actually looked up. So I investigated each of these terms, and I decided that what I meant, without knowing it, was this. So here's this fruit, Puteria sapota. It happens to grow in Costa Rica, where the poem is set. So I thought, you know, I'll bet that's the plant Moore was talking about. So when she says sapotan, what she actually meant was sapota. It goes by the name sapota. And because I'd been working on this so long, I knew a couple of things about Moore and botanical terms. Whenever you publish a book, I mean, any poet publishing a book, inevitably there are misprints. There are spelling mistakes, typesetting mistakes. There's all kinds of little stuff that goes wrong. So in successive editions, people usually correct it. Well, Moore was very careful about correcting plant names that had gone wrong. So you can see here, 1932 and 1933, there's a poem that had the word salpaglossus with an A, but by 1935, she knew it actually needed an I, salpiglossus, so she corrected it. In 1932 and 1933, again, she had a poem she printed twice that had frangipan, but by 1935, somebody had told her it's frangipani, so she corrected it by adding the I. And in 1935, she published a poem about a tree called a crepe myrtle, spelled like the French pancake. But somebody corrected her, and she changed it. So by 1936, and in all subsequent printings, it's crepe myrtle. So every time she saw a mistake in a botanical name that I know of, she corrected them. Frangipani has one more syllable than frangipan. And for a syllabic poet, that's an enormous change. But she made it anyway, and she didn't actually rewrite the surrounding line to essentially subtract a syllable. She just broke the pattern to get the word right. All right, so here are the variants for that word I was interested in. She published the poem 4 times. The first time, she spelled it with the O, sapoton. Then she corrected it to sapotan, and that's where it stayed. So here's my question. I'm editing this new edition of Moore, and I have found a term that's not right. It's sapotan. I think it should be sapota. I think that's what the fruit's actually called. I have evidence that she corrected that kind of mistake when she found it in her own work. But of course, she's not around to ask anymore. She's long dead. So this is my question to you. What should I do? Okay, I've had 2 suggestions so far. The first is write a footnote. You were born to be an editor. Everything gets a footnote. Yeah, for sure I'm going to write a footnote. But I still have to make a choice because I'm still printing the poem in the book, and it's got to be, I got to make a choice, like what actually gets printed on the page. Your question is, well, shouldn't I go back and see if I'm altering an internal rhyme, which I'm not. But right, so the first reasonable thing to do is say, well, how significant is this change? What am I changing if I change this? I mean, at least one thing that I'm changing is the rhythm of the word. We're going from, in my American pronunciation, sapotan to sapota. So that is a rhythmic variation. I didn't change it. I left it alone. I thought about it. Yeah. I thought about it, and that's what I wanted to do originally. My first strong impulse was, you know what? It's not right. Moore didn't like not being right. I should fix that for her. And it took me a long time to come around to leaving alone. Though I will tell you one little tricky thing that I didn't tell you, which is this. The poem is called The Plummet Basilisk. There is no such animal as a plummet basilisk. There's a plumed basilisk. Now, where she got plummet basilisk, I do not know. But if I was going to start to change things like that, I was going to have to change the title of the poem. And that, I mean, I just didn't have the stomach for. And I hope you see, like, the irony of my arrogance here. I was perfectly happy coming in and throwing back into print all kinds of poems that Moore didn't want you to see. I was totally happy coming back in and saying her revisions are no good. Forget her revisions. Like, look at her earlier stuff. These are enormous interventions. But it came down to questions like one letter. And I was like, oh no, I couldn't possibly touch that. So thank you for going through that little exercise with me. But what I want to emphasize is that every time you pick up a book, somebody edited that book, particularly if you're looking at a collection of somebody now gone. Somebody came through and did exactly what I did for Marianne Moore. Maybe they made less drastic choices, or maybe they didn't, but somebody made choices all the way through, and they made choices at that level, because every book has choices like this to be made. So now, I'm a little evangelical on this subject. You should know who your editor is. You should really care. It matters a whole lot who edited that book, because everything you see in that book passed through your editor's hands, and they made decisions all the way through. You are never seeing the direct poet. You are always seeing through somebody's eyes. So it makes a huge difference how they made their decisions and what kind of decisions they made. So I'm here to tell you, know your editor. It really, really matters. Okay, I thought I would just end by reading you one more poem that Moore dropped from her work that is now back, that I especially love. It's an important poem to me because it's kind of the poem that got me started. When I found out that it existed and that Moore had not included it, I was outraged. And I was in my 20s at that time. This is a long time ago. But it was so good, I just couldn't believe it. So the poem is called Half Deity. And like a lot of Moore's poems, it starts with a phrase that is also part of its first sentence. That is to say, the title is also part of the first line. Half deity, half worm. We all, infant and adult, have stopped to watch the butterfly, last of the elves, and learned to spare the wingless worm that hopefully ascends the tree. The well-known silt tiger swallowtail of South America, with body lightly furred, was that bearing pigments which engraved the lower wings with dragon's blood, weightless. They that have wings must not have weights. This more peninsula-tailed one, with a black pitchfork scallop on sunburnt zebra skin, tired by the trip it made with drover-like tenacity, has been sleeping upright on the elm. Its yellowness, that of the autumn poplar leaf, by day has been observed. Disguised in butterfly bush wedgewood blue, Psyche follows it to that small tree, Micromalus, the midget crab, to the mimosa, and from that to the flowering pomegranate. Baffled not by the quick clouding serene gray moon, but forced by the hot, hot sun to pant, she stands on rug-soft grass, though it is not permitted to gaze informally on majesty in such a manner as might well happen here. The blind, all-seeing butterfly, fearing the slight finger, wanders, as though it were ignorant, across the path, and lights on Zephyr's palm, planting 4 feet soberly. Then, pawing like a horse, turns round, apostrophe-tipped brown antennae porcupining out as it arranges nervous wings. Vexed because curiosity has been pursuing it, it cannot now be calm. The butterfly's round, unglazed china eyes, pale tobacco brown with the large eyes of the nymph on them, gray eyes that now are black, for she, with controlled, agitated glance, observes the insect's face and all's aquiver with significance, enact the scene of cat's eyes on the magpie's eyes by Goya. Butterflies do not need home advice. As though Zephyr and Psyche were patent leather crickets singing loud and gnat-catching garden toad, the swallowtail, bewitched and dangerous, springs away, zebra half-deified, trampling the air as it tramples the flowers, feeding where it pivots. Twig-veined, irascible, fastidious, stubborn, undisciplined zebra, sometimes one is grateful to a stranger for looking very nice. But free to leave the outspread hand it flies, drunken with triviality or guided by visions of strength, off until, diminishing like wreckage on the sea, rising and falling easily, it mounts the swell and keeping its true course with what swift majesty, indifferent to us, is gone. Deaf to approval, magnet nice, as it flutters through airs now slack, now fresh. It has strict ears when the west wind speaks. It was he with mirror eyes of strong anxiety who had no net or flowering shrewd-scented tropical device or lignum vitae perch in half-shut hand, for ours is not a canely land. Nor was it Oberon, but this quiet young man with piano replies named Zephyr, whose hand spread out was enough to tempt the fiery tiger horse to stand, eyes staring skyward and chest arching bravely out, historic metamorphoser, and saintly animal in India, in Egypt, anywhere. His talk was as strange as my grandmother's muff. So weird. Okay, thank you so much.
So I'm still stuck on your very first slide where I actually wrote this down, where she said, we cannot admire what we do not understand. And I actually disagree with that.
Uh-huh.
But you agreed with her and
I
said
do.
that you made a point of this in your classes, right? But then right afterwards, you did agree. You did disagree with it because you then got to the line
And
where
I
she
said, I don't
said,
understand it, but I love it. You're right.
imaginary gardens with real toads. You don't understand it. You love it, right?
Well,
Is that not contradictory? I mean, we can admire. I mean, my first thought, I hasten to admit, is that I thought of Trump voters, right? They admire
don't
him. They
say
do not
that
understand.
name in this sacred, safe space.
I don't think understanding is a prerequisite for admiring something.
Well, since you have called me out publicly, I will go back and speak a little more precisely. What I like about the line, we do not admire what we cannot understand, is first of all, I think for someone who reads poetry for a living, I am remarkably literal-minded. I really do get frustrated very easily when I don't understand what a poem is talking about. I have a lot of sympathy with my students who say, I just don't get poetry, and I think I am right there with you. When I don't get it, I get frustrated. So for me, it's actually, one thing I like about Moore is that she believed in clarity of thought. She liked sentences that had structure and ideas that you could follow. However, when I said that I think what I said was, I don't know what it means. I may have said I don't understand it. I would say that I actually do understand that line. You know, I think I understand it quite well. Although I could not, say, point you to an imaginary garden with a real toad in it. I certainly couldn't explain to you how it would be possible to have a real toad in an imaginary garden. But I understand it perfectly well. It has that immediate metaphoric logic that, you know, keeps me coming back to poems. I think it's sort of neatly and pithily said about something that's impossible to kind of say any other way.
Toad on the page of the poem.
Like a real toad sitting on a page of a poem?
That's the image that conjures for me.
Read it, read it.
But there's also, I mean, there's more than one way to understand something.
Yeah.
And my experience with her is, I don't understand the literal, or even what she's metaphorically pointing toward or pointing at, but I have this really powerful sense of the presence of an intelligence.
Yes.
And I can tell, or I have the feeling of someone's intelligence, especially when I don't understand them.
Mm-hmm.
So in that context, what I don't understand is nonetheless very present for me, and hence admirable.
Yeah,
Sorry, it's not a question.
no, that's fine. We're all friends here. We're not asking questions anymore. Yeah, I mean, if you care about writing, you know, you care about it because you have that sense of a powerful and different mind that you can connect with. And of course, it's a very different thing to say, I don't understand it, therefore it's worthless, and or to say, I will never finally understand this. You know, I will have moments of understanding or moments of not understanding or insights, but I will never come to rest with it. And that, of course, is what that's the Holy Grail. That's what you're always looking for.
Nobody would apply this to music, for
You don't think so? I mean,
I think it helps and it can deepen your appreciation, but it's not a requirement.
well, I'm coming to this as someone who knows really nothing about music. I do not understand music in any way that, anyone with.
Do you like it?
But I do. I like it very much. But. I'm thinking of my husband here, actually, who, I'm from Alabama. I didn't grow up there, but that's where I live now. And my husband is from Alabama, and he loves music. He loves music. But I remember once he just got enraged when someone at the symphony played some really avant-garde music, which seems to me a perfect example of music he didn't understand, because it didn't have the tonal scale he was used to. It didn't have the earmarks of structure that he was used to. He just fundamentally didn't understand it. And because he didn't understand it, it just didn't accord with what he thought of as music. It was impossible for him to like it. And I think that that's a pretty general reaction. I don't understand music in the sense that I could explain to you anything about it. I really genuinely know nothing about music. But I have, my ear has been trained by a lifetime of listening to Western music. So I have, a category of music that I get.
She says we do not admire what we can't understand. So I think it's in response to someone who immediately doesn't admire something.
That's a very nice distinction. That's absolutely true.
I would say that the admiring what you cannot understand is within a small context, like when you describe the music and not understanding that music and therefore not admiring it. But I would say that we live in a time, and she did as well, when admiring what you did not understand is actually dangerous. And that's a different category of admiring. And I would think that it would be very sad to go through life without admiring things, but most of us understand very little.
The last poem about the butterfly, that's really kind of a collage and a sort of cut up, isn't it? And pieced. Ellen was saying last week that she was a big collector of images and all kinds of things out of magazines she had cut up. And that seems like a very good example of that.
Yeah, the only thing I regretted about the poems that I chose for you today is that they don't actually show you that Moore has, a lot of her poems are simply made of quoted phrases. Almost every line is quoted from another source. So a lot of them really are much more like cut-ups or collages than the ones that I read for you today. But we did have, pathetic PowerPoint skills. Like, I am out of presentation mode. I cannot make it advance. Like, this is the level at which I work. I don't know. There was a quotation in here somewhere that she... Is it right there? Thank you. It is not permitted. Yes, right. So that's a perfect example of something that Moore does all the time. I'd have to look in the notes to find out where she lifted that phrase, but I guarantee you it wasn't in anything about butterflies or poetry. It had some completely other context. She liked the phrasing. She just lifted it and stuck it in the poem.
The butterfly's a cipher to pull everything into.
Yes, that's right. Her most famous poem that works this way is called Marriage. It's a 4 or 5 page poem made almost entirely of phrases taken from elsewhere, a few of which have to do with marriage, most of which don't, but somehow marriage becomes the principle by which a magnet drawing iron filings, just all this stuff comes together.
But I'm really interested in kind of especially being the editor of all of this, and this meticulous editing process that she's doing herself. Did you notice any sort of repeated things that she would take away from her work, or what sort of patterns went into her kind of editing process? Because, there's more than, poetry is probably the most kind of extreme example of her editing, but I'm sure she went through, 5 or 6 different, so.
You are absolutely right. It's a wonderful question. I guess I would say 2 things. One was, particularly as she grew older, she started to think of poetry as a good way to tell people things that would be good for them to hear, like to teach them lessons. So she became much less interested in her early work, which was just dense with crazy detail. And she really wanted to get to like the moral of the story. So she went back and she just cut out a lot of the crazy detail. Gone, you know, and she did not respect her earlier syllabic patterns. She would just go in and she would just, you know, take chunks out of stanzas and replace them with like a line of 6 dots. So you get these really sort of weird, ragged, truncated poems. So that's one thing. She went back, she took out a lot of detail. But then the other thing that she did, which is in a way a little more troubling, is she did just suppress poems. So like Half Deity, she first published it in 1936. She collected it in a book in 1941, but already that 1941 version was really different. And then it disappeared forever. And those poems that disappeared forever tend to be very good. You really want to keep your eye on the poems that disappeared. And in my opinion, a lot of them come very close to self-portraiture.
Yeah, because it's interesting, because especially publishing for different sorts of publications and things like that, I'm wondering if she edited different poems to fit those specific types of collections, and like it's super interesting to see how she like views her own work from like multiple perspectives. Like, it's really interesting to see a poet kind of, I guess, I don't know, like edit the structure for the structure that it's in, it's almost like a chameleon poem.
So you're gonna like edit the new collected Marianne Moore. Yeah. When my edition falls out of favor, you'll be right there and you can redo it. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there's a million things that condition a poet's revisions, and she had a real feeling for poetry collections. You know, every time, so she'd publish like 12 poems in magazines, but then she wanted to collect them and make them a book collection, and she would alter them. She would arrange them very carefully. Some of them she would change because she wanted that collection to have a particular feel. And then she would do the whole thing all over again when it came time to do, say, the collected poems or the complete poems. People didn't like them. They did not like the changes. I mean, people liked... people didn't like them, is really the easiest way to say it. Pretty much everybody who had a serious interest in Moore at one time or another protested pretty vigorously. Only in one way that I know of. The only way that she ever defended it, as far as I know, is the epigraph to the 1967 complete poems. That epigraph is, "Omissions are not accidents." So it's not even so much a defense as just a warning, you know? Like, you may not like it, but I did this on purpose. I meant it when I did it. They didn't like it. No, they really didn't, because, you know, mostly what she did was either just disappear poems that they had all read and they'd all admired, or she went back and took poems that they had all read and they all admired, and they took, you know, she took out like one poem, The Frigate Pelican. It started out as 12 stanzas, and by the time she was done revising it, it was 5.5. You know, I mean, just terrible, terrible stuff.
Poems of bishops that she either, you could say, didn't finish or never intended to be published, have since been published.
Yeah.
Let's call those posthumous poems by Bishop. You're publishing pre-posthumous poems.
Yes. Yeah, it's a little
Moore,
bit different.
right? Everybody I know finds the publication of those Bishop poems, except in some sort of black book version, appalling.
Yeah.
Why are your editorial decisions not appalling for the same reason?
I'm sure that they would be appalling to Moore. You know, I mean, one. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I just had to get clear on in my head and comfortable with all the way through was that I was not doing what Moore would have wanted. And, you know, I decided that my loyalty was to the poetry, and that the poetry was simply so good. And moreover, that Moore's work has, over time, fallen a little bit out of favor. She has not had the kind of multiple editions that poets like Williams or like Stevens have had. And I thought that was partly because people just weren't reading her best work. So it's one thing to go read, say, Wallace Stevens saying, this is the best poet alive. You know, this is the poet who's showing us all how to do it. And then you go back and you read her complete poems and you think, yeah, she's pretty good. Well, you're not reading what Wallace Stevens was reading. You're not reading all the poems that he was reading, and you're not reading the versions he was reading. And so in my mind, the only way to really restore her to her proper place in American letters was to give everybody the poet that her peers were reading. So that much of my book is my notes. And mostly what those notes are is giving the alternate versions. So I was very careful actually to make it possible to reconstruct the 1967 complete poems from this book. Like if you really wanted to know Moore's final word, I've given you everything to do that work. It's a little harder than picking up her book, but you could do it, and actually without even that much trouble. I just reversed the priority. I just said, no, primary text is the early poem and late text is the footnote stuff.
I'm following up on Mason's point about the editing, and you really divide that so cleanly into a before and after, into 35 and 53. And I'm wondering, in 35, she was somebody who lived alone and lived...
No, actually.
Oh.
She never lived. She lived...
with her mother.
She lived with her mother. Kids, I'm going to tell you this. Yeah, no, I know. This is like a really scary little cautionary tale. So Moore lived with her mother until her mother's death in 1947. So when her mother died, Moore was in her late 50s. Her mother was in her late 80s. And Moore had lived with her that whole time. And when I say she lived with her mother, I mean they lived in a 2-room apartment where they shared a bed.
So to what do you attribute her decision making in the latter part of her life? Some of it sounds like dementia, and some of it also sounds like somebody responding to being a very public figure. I mean, to throwing out the ball at the ballpark and naming cars and things like that, and that she was suddenly writing for a different audience, as if. Do you think that?
I think, first of all, this is just my opinion, so I'll give you my opinion for what it's worth. Partly, you're quite right. She wanted a broader audience. She didn't want to be an avant-garde poet for specialists. She wanted to publish in major venues. She wanted to publish in the New Yorker and the Atlantic and the Nation, which she did. So some of the changes in her poetry is certainly attributable to that, though I think that's much earlier. I think that's like in the 1940s. That's what she was interested in. Much later in her life, when she really began to slash and burn, I actually think that she was responding to the death of her mother. My little pet theory about this is that her mother was intimately involved in the writing of Moore's poems. Every word that Moore wrote went through her mother. First of all, a lot of them came from her mother. Moore quoted her mother a lot. Her mother revised her poems, like went in and edited and told her very strongly what they ought to sound like. And however oppressive that was, and I think it was plenty oppressive, it also gave Moore something to push back against a little bit. A lot. But I think once her mother died, Moore's heart broke. She never got over that. And I think she went back and was essentially a dutiful daughter, and went back and started to take out that stuff that she thought her mother wouldn't have liked, wouldn't have accorded with her mother's standards, wasn't the kind of thing that her mother was interested in.
But would her mother have liked the George Washington outfit?
I have no idea. No idea what her mother... I don't think so. I don't know. I really don't know. Yeah.
Can I ask a really simple question?
Yeah.
I heard a lot from you along the way of making this book about the agonies of being an editor.
Yeah.
What were the most fun things, the most pleasurable things about being an editor, editing this book?
You know, honestly, I'm sure I complained to you endlessly, but it was all fun. It was all really interesting and fun. I cannot tell you the satisfaction of thinking about all of the people who would not have to go through what I had to go through to get to those poems. I mean, for years, you got to understand that anybody who was interested in Moore, for years, we essentially traded samizdat. You know, we would like sneak into rare book rooms and get illegal photocopies, which we would then distribute to our friends. And it was really exciting because, you know, finally you had the 1930 version of this poetic sequence. And that was all sort of fun and clandestine, but it was also ridiculous. It was like, why do we have a major American poet that no one can get access to their best work? And so now, and actually this is, when I was writing this talk, this happened more than once, I would suddenly think, oh, I want to talk about this, or I want to show them an image of this, and then I'd think, oh God, and where is it? Like, which volume has that version or that? And I would remember that my book had it. My book had it all. There was one place where I could go and I could find it, and it was just this like perennial joy, you know, oh, it's all there. It's not much of an answer to you, but just getting the job done, I cannot tell you. It's like the most satisfying thing I've ever done.
So this should be titled not the new collected, but the new complete.
It's not, actually, and you know, I'm glad you brought that up. It's not complete. I didn't include poems that she published in college magazines and not in national magazines. I didn't include juvenilia.
But in honoring her title of complete poems, you should call them
New Complete Poems. Well, where were you, smart guy, when I was trying to think of a title? It took me forever. Came up with New Collected, and I'm sticking with it.
Sorry, you said no juvenilia, nothing from college magazines. You also said nothing from national magazines?
No. If they were in national magazines, she would publish it. Because some of the
My
college
rule
stuff
was, if it was published on a national or international scale, it went into the book. And that ruled out a lot of student work, but not all student work, some of which she did later publish nationally. Well, there's one really famous instance where Hart Crane sent her his poem, I think it's the Wine Menagerie, right? Which is a long, typically Cranian, insane poem that she cut to ribbons and called Again and published, to his lasting chagrin. So in a sense, she was as ruthless. I mean, I think that's a singular thing. I don't think she did that a lot, but she was certainly capable of it. The other famous instance is when Elizabeth Bishop sent her poem Roosters, and Moore and her mother sat down and rewrote the whole poem and sent it back to Bishop. And that caused a little bit of a rupture, I believe. So yeah, no, I mean, she considered poetry her own or somebody else's stuff to get in and work on, you know. It was never done. It was never...
like what her mother did.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she was trained by the best. There are a lot of poems, particularly, I mean, her revisions, like after about, say, 1947, she would publish a poem in a magazine, sometimes revise it a bit, publish it in a book, and then just leave it alone. But those revisions took place, you know, within like a year of first writing them. So those revisions are really quite different. Those are not hatchet jobs, you know, they really are just like reworking sentences or punctuation or various things like that. So those poems, I guess you could argue maybe the revisions are better.
And would you take those in that case?
In that case, I still published the earlier version, though I included all the variants in the notes, so you can see how she revised them. But as far as the early ones, like the ones where she really went back and cut them to ribbons, no, I don't. I think it was just a tragic mistake on her part. Not an accident, I understand, but a mistake. That's, I think, 100% true. And I mean, the place that I would sort of cite precedent for that is Whitman. So Whitman kept revising and revising and revising, rewriting his own book. But I think it's in, you know, the deathbed edition, whatever that is, 1890 something. He has a note where he says, if anybody cares, this is what I wanted about my work. And then he says, history, I know, won't care. History will do whatever it wants with my work. But just so if anybody wants to know, this is what I wanted. Moore never made that kind of gesture. Like Moore, it was pretty clear that she wanted what she wanted to be everybody's experience of her poetry. And so that's where I really did just decide that I wasn't going to take that. I was going to have my say about it. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.